The question of how do we actually think properly about the world probably roams around the mind of every person in different ways. And the likes of Elon Musk and others have purported this idea of thinking from first principles or first principles thinking as the proper way to think about the world.
First principles analysis, I think, is something that can be applied to really any walk of life.
Reason from first principles rather than by analogy.
So in this video, we're going to talk about what are first principles and what does it mean to think from first principles. And also we're going to discuss what are the limitations to this type of thinking. Does it actually apply to every type of context, or is it really limited in its applications? We're going to delve into all these questions in this video, so stay along with us to find out more. So the best first question to tackle is, what is this idea of first principles thinking? What does it actually mean to think from first principles? And the idea that this framework puts forward is that things or ideas or systems, whatever you're trying to understand, is made up of many different components. So you have a system or an idea that's made up of different components. And first principles thinking is a framework that puts forward the idea that one needs to break down those components into smaller parts in order to understand the whole system, because we don't have the capacity to understand the system as a whole. So we have to break it down to its smaller parts, and then we can probably recompile them and understand the system even better after we actually deconstructed the system or the idea. Having laid this foundation, you might ask, well, at what point do we get to the first principle? Because as we know, in the real world, systems or ideas are compiled of many different layers. So should we break it down once, twice? How many times should we break it down until we get to the first principle? And the answer to this question actually gets to the heart of a main assumption in first principles thinking, which is that ideas or systems are made up of axioms or main assumptions, which eventually end up building the whole system or idea. And a good example of this is mathematics, where we have the whole discipline of calculus built on the idea of arithmetic, whether it's addition or subtraction or division or multiplication. So what we can take away from this is that a main assumption in first principles thinking is that things have axioms or main assumptions, and that those assumptions or main axioms are actually understandable by us. So what we can say to recap first principles in a nutshell is to say that first principles is taking a big idea or system or whatever the thing you're trying to understand is, and breaking it down to smaller compartments. Those small compartments are made up of main assumptions or axioms, and then those axioms go on to build other smaller parts, and those compiled together can go on to build the idea or the system or whatever the case might be. And we also saw that a main assumption in first principles thinking is that these smaller compartments or axioms are actually understandable by us humans. Now, this main assumption we discussed of the first principles framework actually makes it more clear for us to see the limitations of applying first principles thinking, which is a very underrated thing that's usually not talked about. So in order for us to understand the limitations of first principles thinking or the reach of first principles thinking, there is a very important distinction that Dave Snowden made when it comes to the nature of systems, which will be relevant for us in today's discussion. And Dave Snowden made the distinction of systems being simple systems, complicated systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. And those two will be the ones that are relevant for us, which is the complex systems and complicated systems. So a complicated system is basically a system that we could predict the phase space of the things it can do. So a good example of this is computers making programs. So if we put an output, if one has enough expertise to understand computer programs and computer hardware, they would be able to predict the output. As opposed to complex systems where we cannot actually predict the phase space of the things it can do. So a good example of a complex system is the human brain, where we have all these different neurons coming up together, and somehow they give rise to the human consciousness, as unpredictable as it is. No matter how much we understand the human brain, we cannot really predict the thoughts that come out of this human brain. Now, in order to link it with our discussion of first principles could be more applied to complicated systems rather than complex systems, because in complex systems, the whole is basically more than the parts, which is another definition of complex systems. So the human brain has different cells coming up together, and somehow they give rise to the human consciousness, as complex as it is. So from that perspective, consciousness is more than the subcompartmentalized parts of the brain or the neurons. Remember that we said that a main assumption in first principles thinking is that the axioms are understandable to us. Well, in complex systems like the human brain, we don't even know what the axioms are, as opposed to complicated systems where if we apply it to computers, for instance, although it does need some expertise, we could think about it from first principles and arrive at clear results. So from that perspective, the limitation of first principles thinking lies in thinking about systems and categorizing which system are you actually approaching. So if you're approaching a complex system like the economic system, for instance, you cannot actually understand the system by thinking about the first principles or the subcompartmentalized parts, because we don't even understand what those first principles are. As opposed to if you're approaching complicated systems, then in that context, first principles thinking can be useful. Now, the reason why this distinction of the complex and complicated is important and setting the limitations of first principles thinking is important is because a lot of the times people conflate between the complex and complicated. And you hear this actualize itself by people saying that, oh, the human brain is only made up of atoms, for instance. Sure, that might be true, but at the same time, we saw that the complex systems are things that we do not know what their axioms are, basically. So even if the human brain is made up of atoms, there are certainly things that we do not know about the human brain because it gives rise to human consciousness, even though if we break down the atoms at the fundamental level, we do not see any consciousness. So from that perspective, understanding the distinction between the complex and the complicated might make us move away from the reductive approach or trying to just cram things into our understanding, even though our understanding is limited. So from that perspective, it seems to me like this distinction is very enlightening when trying to approach thinking in general, and not necessarily just with systems, even ideas as well. So we've reached the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this video actually deconstructed some misconceptions about the framework of first principles thinking and making it as a one-size-fits-all type of framework. So I hope this actually added some nuance to the discussion. Please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you actually found this content beneficial, and see you next time.